The next type of research we're going to look at is qualitative research. And to begin with this topic, I'm going to give you a phrase. Many of you have heard this, the phrase, spare the rod and spoil the child. When we ask people what that means, we generally get two answers. One, it means if you spare the rod, you will spoil the child. And to others, it means you should spare the rod and spoil the child. So it has two completely different meanings depending upon who you're asking. Now, the reason we bring this up is because that has implications for you as a researcher. Because when you ask somebody a question, you have to be very careful about how you interpret it, because it's possible that you can interpret it wrong. And one of the ways to deal with this is to do something called member checking, where you say, when you told me this, did you mean, etc. And in essence, what you're doing is you're validating the instrument being the researcher when you ask questions. You're making sure that what you're asking has the correct interpretation of what they mean, that your understanding of their answer is exactly the same as their understanding of the answer. So, one of the things that can happen when we ask people questions like this is we can come up with a consensus, but we have to be very careful, as I said, about that, because even if a group of researchers agrees upon what answers might mean, that doesn't mean that they are the right answers, and this has to do with reliability and validity. Because the group of researchers asking the questions can have inter-rater reliability, meaning that we all agree on what we think the answers mean, but it may not have any validity, because if we don't check with the people that we're asking, we can miss it, and therefore our research might be reliable, but it won't be valid. So the inter-rater reliability, especially if you have several different people doing the questions, becomes a very important experience. Very often I'll ask people questions about what were your best school experiences. And they'll come up with things about how they interacted with school, what they enjoyed. Sometimes they'll talk about what they didn't enjoy. And depending upon how people respond to that, we can interpret what we think their experiences were like. But it's possible we can get it wrong. If we were asked somebody a question like this, what were your best school experiences? And they said, well, I didn't have any good school experiences. One way we might interpret that is, well, they didn't like school. That might be true, it might not. We would have to check to find out whether or not that is really right. And we'd ask follow-up questions to determine whether or not we really understood it. And then when I talked a little bit in the other video about a mile wide and an inch deep, or an inch wide and a mile deep, that's what we're talking about with an inch wide and a mile deep. We start asking more and more questions about their experiences to gather qualitative data about school in this case, as opposed to the other way, the quantitative, where we just give a survey to 1,000 people and ask them about their best school experiences. By doing that, though, we're forcing them into thinking a certain way about it. With this method, the qualitative, we allow for some interpretation of how they feel, and we can gather more data about that. To look at a qualitative study, I want to post this situation on the discussion board, and I would like for the groups to respond to that. And what we're interested in is studying the effects of alcoholism on family. And I want us to discuss the methodology of how we could do that, the appropriate ways, the inappropriate ways, that kind of thing. So I'm going to leave this and put that in the discussion board. When we report on qualitative research, or when you look at qualitative research, one of the questions that's often asked is, do demographics matter if we only have a few participants? They matter because we're trying to build a case for our study. Because we only have a few participants, it's very important that we paint a very clear picture of what this group looks like. Because we have such a small group, if somebody wanted to replicate it, it's really important that they understand exactly the group that we're trying to deal with. So, because if it's not exactly the same group, it may not work the same. The other part about this type of research is the methodology and the analysis tends to be very extensive. I want you to think about the idea of looking at a qualitative group where we have a small group of 4 or 5 people where we're providing a treatment to that group. It's what we're doing in that treatment. That is the experiment for that group. And if somebody else wants to replicate that in a qualitative study, they have to do it in exactly the same manner as the previous researcher. And if this occurs enough times with similar small groups, then we can start to do what's called a meta-analysis to gather lots and lots of information about the exact same groups over and over and over. And that's going to go back to the first issue of the demographics. It's really important that those demographics be described, because if we can start to replicate for example, some kind of psychological intervention. I know one of the people on their research idea talked about a parenting class. It's really important in that reason, if that research would be conducted, if that parenting class made a difference with that group, that we really understand what happened all the time during the parenting class, because that is the experiment in this case. So that's why the methodology becomes so critical in qualitative research. There's a couple of 2 or 3 discussion boards that you'll have to participate in for this chapter, the quantitative and qualitative. This is to help you better understand what it is that you're looking at in your research when you try to review articles, and also to give you some ideas about how to start designing yours.